As we've been discussing Zoroastrianism, one of the primary things that we've learned is that it was a complex and multifaceted tradition, and that it, just like all religions, was diverse, being made up of various subgroups and schools. Recently, we explored the fascinating movement often known as Zurvanism, and discussed whether it can actually be seen as a school, or maybe more likely, a certain theological tendency among certain groups of Zoroastrians during Sasanian times. But another development around the same time and historical context is another group that can much more confidently and rightly be called a separate movement within Zoroastrianism, or even, to use polemical language, a sect of Zoroastrianism, which was known as Mazdakism. This is a really interesting movement that had esoteric and unusual interpretations of Zoroastrian teachings and scripture, and whose social teachings has also sometimes been compared with socialism and even communism, but in an ancient late antique context. So who are the Mazdakites, and what do we know about their teachings? As we usually do, we should begin this discussion by talking about the sources. What are the sources that we can draw on to try to understand the Mazdakite movement? And thankfully, unlike the situation with Zurvanism, where our sources are very lacking, here we do have a lot more sources. We have sources that are contemporary with the movement itself to some degree. There are some Syriac and Greek Byzantine sources, but also sources from after the Islamic period, a lot more so than for Zurvanism. So the situation is a lot better here than it was for Zurvanism, but it also runs into the same problem. Most of these sources at least, is in that they are not internal sources. They don't come from the Mazdakites themselves, but rather from outsiders, often be those who are critical of the group, right? So we have to keep this in mind and take a lot of it maybe with a bit of a grain of salt. The most useful sources, again, come from the later Islamic writings. Once again, our friend Ash-Shahrastani provides a pretty good description of the group, as well as Ibn Nadim, the great author of the compendium known as the Fihrist. There is also Al-Mas'udi, Shamsuddin al-Maqdisi, and even the famous vizier Nizam al-Mulk, and so on. But as we said, many of these sources are quite polemical in nature, and it is thus unlikely that they present the movement in an entirely fair and neutral way. Much of these discussions are in the context of critiquing certain Shi'i extremist groups, known as Ghulat groups in Arabic, who are often seen by the critics as having been essentially influenced by the Mazdakite movement. And so when we look at these sources, we should do so carefully because of these reasons, obviously. The name Mazdakism comes from the name of one of the central figures of the movement, Mazdak. He seems to have indeed been a key figure for the group and who might have instigated some of their characteristic teachings. But in fact, many of our sources indicate that the movement actually existed before him, and that it actually originated with a figure known as Zaradusht, son of Khurradam. The time frame of when he lived is uncertain, but it probably wasn't too long before Mazdak in the 6th century, perhaps a century or two before, if even that. Some accounts say that he had traveled to Rome, and maybe some would speculate maybe he became influenced by Gnostic teachings of the Gnostic Christian groups, or possibly Manichaeism, and that he then settled in Sasanian Persia, where he instigated a new interpretation of Zoroastrianism based on these influences. Indeed, in Ibn Nadim's account, he talks about two Mazdaks, Mazdak the Elder and Mazdak the Younger, and it's quite probable that Mazdak the Elder refers to this earlier originating figure of the movement. But it is of course Mazdak himself, or Mazdak the Younger in Ibn Nadim, that has become the quintessential leader and symbol for the movement. According to the stories, he was a Mobed or Zoroastrian priest that probably lived from the 5th to the early 6th century, during the rule of the Sasanian king Kavad. accounts place Mazdak's death around 524 or 528, so sometime in the 520s probably. He was very successful at spreading this unique esoteric interpretation of Zoroastrianism and of instigating certain social reforms that emphasized egalitarianism, equality, and non-violence. He was so successful that the Sasanian king, Kavad, actually became a devoted adherent of this movement, at least initially, thus giving Mazdak and the Mazdakites significant political influence for a period. So what were the teachings of Mazdak and the Mazdakites then? What did this unique interpretation, if we can call it that, of Zoroastrianism look like? Well, we do know a few things about this from our sources, but it's also a bit complicated. There is a group known as the Khurramites, or Khurramdinan, and this was a group that existed in the post-Islamic period. This is a group in Iran during the Umayyad Abbasid times that were seen by the Muslims as a kind of extremist Shi'i group, a Ghulat group, so to say. But many scholars, not just modern scholars, but even scholars back then, Muslim scholars, argued that this was just basically the Mazdakites that had adopted to a new Islamic context. So that the Khurramites are actually the Mazdakites in a new Islamic garb. And so when scholars want to find out about the Mazdakite teachings, their theology and so on, there's some sources that talk about the Mazdakites proper of the Sasanian times, but scholars will also often use descriptions of the Khurramites in the Islamic period, which are more elaborate and more numerous. But this is based on the idea that the teachings of the Khurramites are thus a direct continuation of the Mazdakites, right? Which is probably true to a degree, but we also then have to keep in mind that just like all religions, things develop, and because they had adopted to this new Islamic environment, they had taken on certain new teachings from that environment perhaps, and so on. So we can't, it's probably not a one-to-one thing. So that's important also to remember. But indeed, when we do compare these descriptions of the Khurramites to that of the Mazdakites, they're very, very similar to each other. So we have pretty good grounds for arguing that they are the same thing. And that this means that looking at the Khurramite sources or the descriptions of the Khurramites can be very helpful in our understanding of the Mazdakites in general. Now, on a basic level, the Mazdakite teachers like Mazdak seems to have taught a strongly esoteric interpretation of Zoroastrianism. Mazdak, the younger or elder, saw himself as giving the true interpretation, Zend, of the Avesta, so the Zoroastrian canon of scriptures, and to purify the religion to its true state through esoteric interpretation of these scriptures. Al-Mas'udi actually corroborates this idea in his writings when claiming that he actually met and spoke with living Mazdakites in his time. Quote, Mazdak was the interpreter, al-Muta'awwil, of the Book of Zoroaster, the Avesta, and he is the first among those who believed in interpretation, ta'wil, and inner meanings, batin. This is very significant for those who study things like Islamic esotericism, where these terms and concepts are very prominent, right? Interestingly, as scholar Ehsan Yarshater points out in an article about Mazdakism, it is this esoteric doctrine that gives us one of the most popular terms for heretics in Arabic, zindiq. The Mazdakites were actually the first or main people who were referred to as zindiq or zanadiqa in plural. Not necessarily because they were heretics per se, but because they made an interpretation, which in Middle Persian is called a zand. So a zindiq is someone who interprets, perhaps specifically an interpretation of the esoteric kind. And then the term, of course, then became a popular term for any kind of heretic later on in the Arabic language. Anyway, we're getting off track. This esoteric interpretation that they used also resulted in some really unique teachings and theological ideas, still mostly recognizably Zoroastrian for the most part, but a very unique interpretation and perspective on some Zoroastrian ideas. In terms of pre-Islamic Mazdakism proper, our best source is once again Ash-Shahrastani, who outlines some of the core doctrines of the movement. First of all, Mazdak seems to have taught a strict vertical ontological dualism, meaning that reality is made up of two fundamental principles, light and darkness. Again, this is quite classic Zoroastrian and Manichaean teachings. In Zoroastrianism, we of course have the concept of Asha and Druj, which is like order, justice, and lie and deception. Light and darkness represented by the gods Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, or Ormazd and Ahriman, right? And Manichaeism has a similarly kind of dualistic picture, probably very influenced by Zoroastrianism to begin with. Quote, light is endowed with knowledge and feeling and acts by design and free will, whereas darkness is ignorant and blind and acts at random and without direction. The admixture of the two is the result of pure accident, as will be their separation. Shahrastani then claims that they believe in three elements, water, fire, and earth. That there are two managers, a manager of good and one of evil, probably representing light and darkness respectively. This account also says that they believe in a certain object of veneration, perhaps some kind of supreme being or high god, but that this god is transcendent and not very involved with the world directly. This instead being left to the two lower managers that I just mentioned. Below this supreme being / god is then a bunch of different hierarchies of divine beings or forces. Werner Sunderman summarizes it like this, quote, arrayed before him, this object of worship, are the four powers, discernment, understanding, memory, and joy. They are comparable to the four highest dignitaries at the Sasanian court, the high priest, the great teacher, the commander of the army, and the court musician. The four powers govern the world through 7 ministers. The Middle Persian titles for these beings have not yet been fully explained. The 7 are the commander, the provost, the unidentified, something I can't pronounce, the messenger, the expert, the statesman, and the page. These ministers are said to revolve within the 12 spiritual beings, whose names are all Middle Persian present participles. They have been identified with the 12 signs of the zodiac by all interpreters. Finally, Shahrastani reported that the ruler of the upper world governs by means of those letters that represent the sum of his name, probably a reference to the alphabetic numerals, though which alphabet is not clear. The Mazdakites also seem to believe that these divine forces can become embodied in special human beings, so in holy men who thus hold divine authority on earth, something that in later times became referred to as imams, borrowing from the Islamic and especially Shi'i vocabulary. Now, interestingly, they also seem to have held some kind of lettrism, as we saw at the end of this quote, in that letters, words, and numbers seem to have played an important role in the system, being powers by which the world is created and also esoteric tools to better understand the secrets of reality. These are themes that we of course recognize from a lot of later occultism within and beyond the Islamic world. In other words, these are all teachings that are familiar to those of us who have encountered things like Gnosticism, Hermeticism, and other esoteric movements of late antiquity. Indeed, it is also claimed that the Mazdakites held to a kind of macrocosm-microcosm vision, where the contents of the cosmos is seen to be mirrored in the human being in some way, which we of course know from things like Hermeticism, as well as the general idea that those people who have reached a sufficient level of divine knowledge are no longer bound to outer religious practice. Now, this obviously tells us quite a bit about the possible doctrines of this fascinating group, but there is even more stuff if we accept the idea that the later Khurramites are a continuation of the Mazdakite movement. For example, Shamsuddin al-Maqdisi writes in the 10th century about the Khurramites, quote, and this is a bit of a longer quote, "They are all united in believing in the doctrine of return, raja'a. They believe in the change of names and bodies. They profess that the prophets, despite the difference of their laws and their religions, do not constitute but a single spirit, and that revelation is never discontinued. They maintain that every man of religion, so long as he entertain hope of reward and fear of punishment, is on the right path and cannot be insulted or considered a transgressor so long as he does not attempt to endanger their community and destroy their religion. They avoid carefully the shedding of blood, except when they raise the banner of revolt. They revere Abu Muslim and curse Abu Ja'far for having him killed. They have many prayers for Mahdi bin Fairuz, the son of Fatima, Abu Muslim's daughter. They have imams, to whom they refer to for decisions, and prophets who go in circles among them, and whom they call apostles. They seek the greatest sacramental effect from wine and drinks. The basis of their doctrine is belief in light and darkness. Those whom we met from among the Khurramis in their region, in Masabadan and Mihrajan Qadak, were extremely concerned with cleanliness and purification and with approaching people with kindness and beneficence. We found some among them who believed in free sex, provided that women agreed to it, and also in the freedom of enjoying all pleasures and of satisfying one's inclinations so long as this does not entail any harm to others. This is a really fascinating account, obviously. It does corroborate some of the things that were said about the Mazdakites by Shahrastani, but also adds certain new things, like the last part about their relationship to women and certain social ideas and practices that the Mazdakites have become so famous for. Because indeed, Mazdak, going back to the original Mazdakite movement of Sasanian times, Mazdak and the Mazdakites are famous for having instigated a kind of social reform, one that was quite radical and unusual for that time, and which has, again, often today by scholars, been compared to or even sort of equated with socialism and even communism. Now, all of this, the entire message of Mazdak, was probably a direct response to and a result of the prevailing and chaotic environment in Sasanian Iran at that time. Only a few decades before, the king Piruz had suffered a severe loss to the Heftalites, which put the state in a situation where they had to pay tribute to these Heftalites, resulting in an economic crisis. The social situation had also become quite unequal, with the highest classes of the nobility and the Zoroastrian clergy holding basically all of the power and hoarding wealth. They also practiced polygamy with large harems that left the lower classes with limited resources and options for marriage. Ali Reza Shahpur Shahbazi says, quote, "When Kavad ascended the throne in 488, troubles appeared everywhere. Wars and recent famines had devastated the land and emptied the treasury, yet a hefty annual tribute had to be paid to the Heftalites. Armenia, Iberia, Arabs, and some tribes of the Zagros region were in revolt, and the Huns were ravaging the northern regions, while the Romans continued to withhold the subsidy for guarding the Caucasus passes. The nobility had become too powerful and paid no heed to the royal authority, while the commoners had become poor and desperate." Mazdak seems to have come with a message that aimed to change this and to improve the situation for the people. His new interpretation of Zoroastrianism was one that was significantly less ritualized and formalized. Some accounts say that they didn't really put any weight on performing rituals at all. Instead, they aimed to live pious lives, to abstain from sins and the corrupting aspects of this world. Hunger seems to have been considered something positive, for example, indicating a kind of renunciate lifestyle of quote-unquote holy living, similar to many other religious movements at that time, but obviously very different from standard Zoroastrianism at that time. Shahrastani says, quote, "Mazdak commanded the killing of tempted souls in order to release them from evil and from the admixture with darkness." And other accounts also indicate that the Mazdakites were told to avoid things like wrath, envy, vengeance, greed, and mead, which were together referred to as the 5 demons. So clearly, according to many sources, this was a kind of pietistic, ascetic movement that distinguished themselves from quote-unquote orthodox Zoroastrians. But at the same time, as Yarshater points out, other sources portray them as essentially hedonists, told to enjoy the pleasures of life, including food and sex. And perhaps the truth, as it so often does, rather lies somewhere in between these two extremes. Certainly, they appear to be different from other contemporary movements like the Christian Gnostics and the Manichaeans, who had a much more negative view of the world and the universe in general. Quote, Mazdakism differs from Gnostic teachings, and especially Manichaeism, in its fundamentally positive, non-ascetic attitude toward the world and the powers that govern it, especially in its positive interpretation of the planets, in which it differs also from Zoroastrianism. The possible influence of philosophical ideas cannot be excluded, but a dependence on the thought of the Neoplatonist Porphyry cannot be demonstrated. It is worth noting, too, that Christian ideas are totally absent from Mazdakism. So our sources differ. Some call them, some sources seem to indicate that they were quite ascetic, a very sort of pietistic ascetic movement, whereas others call them hedonist, and certainly compared to Christianity and Manichaeism, which are very relatively extreme ascetic movements, especially for the religious elite, so to say, this does not seem to have been the case for the Mazdakites to the same degree, even if they did have a certain level of asceticism and renunciation as part of their teachings, and especially in the context of Zoroastrianism, which is seen as a much more world-affirming, perhaps, religion and religious teaching and practice. So the Mazdakites, compared to Orthodox Zoroastrianism, might have been very pietistic ascetic, but compared to like Christianity and certain forms of Neoplatonism like Porphyry, which was mentioned here, or Manichaeism and so on, they're not that extreme. So they're probably somewhere in between there, I would argue. But as we've alluded to, this program of reform also involved more directly social reforms and innovations. For example, Mazdak seems to have taught a redistribution of wealth, to take some of the massive wealth from the higher classes and distribute it among the poor, and even for all wealth and property to be evenly distributed across all of society. Thalabi writes, quote, Mazdak declared that God placed the means of subsistence on earth so that people divide them among themselves equally, in a manner that no one of them could have more than his share. But people wronged one another and sought dominion over one another. The strong defeated the weak and took exclusive possession of livelihood and property. It is absolutely necessary that one take from the rich for giving to the poor, so that all become equal in wealth. Whoever possesses an excess of property, women, or goods, he has no more right to it than another. This was thus an egalitarian movement that sought to equalize wealth across society, that the state functions in such a way that wealth is equally distributed, so that everyone is on the same level and common standing. This is what so many people today have compared to the modern notions of socialism and even communism. And indeed, it's hard to look at the social principles of Mazdak and not think that the similarities are quite striking. Could we have with him the first historical example of socialism more than 1,000 years before thinkers like Marx? It's a very fascinating and maybe plausible idea, albeit of course a bit anachronistic. Now famously, it is claimed that this egalitarianism also included women. That women are also not the property of a single man, but shared in common and equally distributed, to use like pretty unpleasant language, right? We saw some indication of this, or something similar to it, in that earlier quote from Al-Maqdisi as well, who said, quote, we found some among them who believed in free sex, provided that women agreed to it, and also in the freedom of enjoying all pleasures and of satisfying one's inclinations, so long as this does not entail any harm to others. If you remember what we said earlier, accounts state that the Sasanian environment before this had been one where the higher classes practiced polygamy and often had many different wives or women as part of their harems, thus creating a great inequality in this regard as well. If there was any such doctrine among the Mazdakites, it was probably a response to this. Women could now marry outside of their own class, and no man could exclusively own women in the way that had been previously practiced by the nobility. How much we should believe in the idea that women were shared commonly among the male population in this way, and as Maqdisi says that they practice some kind of free sex, is hard to say for sure. Obviously, this is one of the big tropes of polemical literature, If you read, and especially from this time, right, if you read polemical literature, people criticizing others, they will often accuse those others, those heretics, of practicing some kind of being like promiscuous or being sexually immoral. All right, so this is a very common trope, and for this reason it should be taken with a grain of salt. But at the same time, we can be quite confident in assuming that the social reform instigated by Mazdak included the role of women and certain changes to how that worked. Of course, back then, women were essentially property of men, right? So because property laws were reformed, that must have included these kinds of questions too. So that's quite likely, but the extent to which that was true and how it worked is, of course, impossible to know. It's also often claimed that the Mazdakites were essentially pacifist, rejecting any kind of violence except in instances where they would have to rise up in revolt, especially in the later periods. Yarshater lists these basic teachings as characteristic of the Khurramite/Mazdakites in later sources. Quote, ethics. 1. Prohibition of the shedding of blood except during insurrection. 2. Tolerance of individual religious views within a broad framework of faith. 3. Beneficence and goodwill toward others. 4. Enjoyment of pleasure without causing harm to others. In all this, Mazdak seems to have been quite successful. As we said before, the Sasanian king Kavad became a devoted follower of this movement and supported its reforms and teachings. This was definitely not uncontroversial, though. The quote-unquote orthodox Zoroastrian clergy and establishment was deeply critical of Mazdak and his teachings. Not only was his interpretation of the Avesta seen as essentially heretical, but the social reforms also upended and challenged the social order and class system that in many ways upheld the clerical establishment. Kavad was essentially deposed as king due precisely to his supporting Mazdakism, instead being replaced by his brother. When he, a few years later, managed to return to the throne, he was significantly less enthusiastic about Mazdak and his teachings. He probably didn't abandon it or stop adhering to it, but he was significantly a lot more careful publicly. But the fortunes of the Mazdakites were soon to turn. By the end of his rule, Kavad had basically lost most of his power, and the de facto ruler of the Sasanian state was his son, Khusro, who was a lot more inclined toward the, again, quote-unquote, orthodox Zoroastrian establishment and clergy. He wanted to get rid of Mazdak and his followers, so they established a mock trial where Mazdak was to debate against Zoroastrian priests and Christians, where he, as planned, lost and was then deemed a heretic. The most famous story about Mazdak's end comes from the Shahnameh, the massive poem by Firdausi, often considered the national epic of Iran. Here, it is said that Khusro invited Mazdak to see a new garden that he had built. But when Mazdak arrived and was led to this garden, his blood turned icy cold as he realized that the trees in this garden were in fact his own followers and companions who had been executed and buried upside down, only their legs sticking out of the ground. 3,000 of the Mazdakites are said to have been killed by Khusro. The king told Mazdak, "Look at the garden that you have planted." Then they seized Mazdak himself, hung him upside down, and shot him with arrows until he died. With their leader dead and official support from the state ended, the Mazdakites went underground essentially, and were severely oppressed and persecuted by the Sasanian state and the Zoroastrian establishment. At least the more quote-unquote militant aspect of the movement was subdued by the government, whereas the general attitude of the followers of Mazdak that were more ascetic and austere continued to exist and even be respected and to some degree supported by the state. These mendicant ascetics and quote-unquote poor people were called driosh in Middle Persian, which is actually where we later get the term darwish in New Persian, a word strongly associated with Sufis, who were also mendicant, poor mystics and ascetics. As a result of these events, Khusro and Kavad before him also made significant reforms of the government and society, possibly influenced by the general message of the Mazdakite movement and their critique of earlier status quo, while simultaneously, of course, viewing Mazdak and his followers themselves to be heretics. The nobility and clergy were significantly weakened by the Mazdakite movement and their official support, and this allowed for these reforms to take place. Measures were taken to improve the situation of the poor, who were now also allowed to serve in the army, for example. Taxation was reformed and other measures to stabilize the state both economically and socially. So while the Mazdakites proper were being oppressed by the Sasanian state, they had still significantly affected society and its development going forward. They didn't die out completely, but managed to survive in smaller pockets across the region. And when the Arab conquest happened and the Sasanian Empire collapsed entirely, that persecution ended. Fortunately, the Umayyad Muslims weren't that much better either, and persecution still continued. But the Mazdakites still managed to survive partly by assimilating into the new Islamic environment. Outwardly, they seem to have adopted a kind of Shi'i character, while still holding to the classic Mazdakite teachings. And it is this group that became known as, among other things, the Khurramites, as we have mentioned before. The idea that the Khurramites are essentially Mazdakites that have assimilated in some way to Islam is corroborated by al-Maqdisi, who says, quote, "The Khurramis are one of the categories of the Mazdaeans, the Zoroastrians, who cover themselves under the guise of Islam. They believe that the principle of the universe is light, of which a part has been effaced and has turned into darkness." The name Khurramites essentially come from the Persian word khurram, which means happy or joyful. So the Khurramiyya in Arabic essentially means the happy ones, or Khurramdini, deen meaning religion, is essentially the happy religion. What this refers to in particular is not certain, but many scholars have argued that it is related to the teaching of the faith of enjoying the pleasures of life and so on that we saw before. In the earlier quote from the same author, we also got some information about the early history and teachings of the Khurramite phase of Mazdakism, including the reference for the figure of Abu Muslim. Now, Abu Muslim is a really fascinating guy. He was an Iranian military commander who played a central role in the Abbasid revolution that deposed the Umayyads in 750. After the revolution was successful, however, he was assassinated by the new Abbasid Caliph, according to some accounts, because of his extreme views and possible association with the Ghulat, the extremists, maybe specifically the Khurramites. And among the latter, the Khurramites, he is indeed seen as a significant, almost holy figure who almost managed to depose the Arabs and re-establish just rule based on their religious tradition, but that he was then martyred. We can look at that quote again from al-Maqdisi with all of this in mind. Quote, "They revere Abu Muslim and curse Abu Ja'far, the Abbasid Caliph, for having him killed. They have many prayers for Mahdi bin Fairuz, the son of Fatima, Abu Muslim's daughter. They have imams to whom they refer for decisions and prophets who go in circles among them and whom they call apostles." The Khurramites continued to be politically and socially active even after this, and even produced some revolts against the Abbasids, most famously under a leader called Babak. These were all crushed by the Caliphate, however. Much can be said about these figures like Babak and their revolts, of course, but that's going to have to be left for a future, maybe dedicated episode to some of those, and is outside the scope of this more introductory episode about the origins of, or the original Mazdakites in particular. Regardless, it's clear that this group survived for quite a while in the Islamic world, and many argue that they may have had an influence on certain esoteric movements within Islam, especially some of those extremist Ghulat sects of Shi'ism. As we saw, some of the teachings of the Mazdakites are certainly similar to many of the teachings of esoteric Shi'ism. And later writers like Nizam al-Mulk in the 11th century made a direct connection between the Batinis, the Ismailis, and the Mazdakites. Now here we must be very careful because the Batinis, the Ismailis, were of course Nizam al-Mulk's both religious, doctrinal, and political enemies. The Ismailis were at that time ruling Egypt and the Fatimid Empire, who was the main enemies of the Abbasids in places like Baghdad where Nizam al-Mulk was operating. And so he is of course trying to discredit the Ismailis, the Batinis. This is where this quote even comes from, or this reference comes from, is that he's trying to discredit the Shi'is, the Ismailis, the Batinis as he calls them, the esotericists, by essentially saying that they're not real Muslims because they're just influenced by this Mazdakite Khurramite movement, right? And of course, religious affiliation and influence is a lot more complex than that too, and it's likely that all these movements absorb things from each other through mingling in the common intellectual and religious environment of the Middle East and Central Asia at that time. So rarely do we see a kind of direct influence one way or the other, right? It's a commingling of different ideas and traditions, which is always the case. The same with Zoroastrianism. We also say that Zoroastrianism influenced monotheism and Judaism and Christianity. Probably did, right? But it's not that simple. There's just this one line of influence. It's a very complex web of interactions and influences in many different directions that's always going on. But looking just at the doctrines, it certainly seems that the Mazdakites might have been very influential on some ideas among certain groups. For example, the Khurramites, or the Kharmatians, were a unique group within the Ismaili environment, share similarities with the Mazdakites not only in theology and symbolic esotericism, but even in some of those social features and communist adjacent teachings. So here it is perhaps less controversial to make these kinds of connections. The prominence of lettrism and occult speculation about language and numbers would also become quite prominent in esoteric aspects of Islam, and the connection with Mazdak and other antique movements is of course very interesting and significant. Some have even tried to connect the Mazdakites with the emergence of Sufism in the Islamic environment, but this is harder to justify. Certainly, the Mazdakites, just like ascetic Christians and other groups in the region, all held ascetic and renunciate pietistic tendencies that might have been absorbed by the early Islamic mystics to different degrees, but a direct line of influence is hard to say or to prove. In any case, Mazdak and the Mazdakites, even outside of their possible influence on some of these later religious philosophical movements, stand as a really interesting example of a social and religious movement in late antiquity, one that in a lot of aspects fit right into that historical milieu and environment in terms of their teachings and many of their ideas. But in terms of other aspects, they're very unique and different, even for that time, and even more generally. They're very interesting and stand out historically. For example, by practicing certain ideas and teachings that wouldn't become popular for millennia or more after them. They're also a good indication of the huge diversity, not just of religion in the late antique world, but also of Zoroastrianism in particular, and the development and internal discussions within that very significant and fascinating religion. Thank you so much for listening and for watching this fascinating another episode in the series on Zoroastrianism. I want to extend a special thank you to my Patreon community who keeps this channel going by supporting me monetarily, which is hugely helpful and so appreciated. Thank you as always for all the support. I would highly appreciate if anyone else wanted to become a patron. So I will leave links to that in the description. You can choose different tiers of how much you want to pay, and there are some exclusive content and Discord chats and so on, but mainly you're supporting the work that I do here of providing free content about religion and mysticism and philosophy and history and all these things that we talk about on this channel. So highly appreciated. You can also support by leaving a one-time donation either on Patreon or through PayPal, or if that works better for you, you can just subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and like the video. It's all very, very helpful. And I appreciate all the comments and the wonderful discussions that are happening in the comment section. So keep that going. If you want to follow me in my work, you can, it's here, right? You can follow my socials on Instagram and TikTok and so on. My handle is usually it's Philip Holm, where I post stuff related to the same stuff that I do here, as well as my music. And speaking of my music, there is also my other channel, Philip Holm, which is dedicated to music, posting my own music, talking about music in the way that I talk about religion here and so on. So go subscribe to that and check out some of those videos. But for now, thank you again so much for watching and listening, and I will see you next time.